Great. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. For those who are on Central Time, I think it's still good morning. Welcome to this Blytheville Cold War Forum, sponsored by the National Cold War Center. My name is Christian Ostermann. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and its partnership with the National Cold War Center in Blytheville, Arkansas. The National Cold War Center is located on the grounds of the former Blytheville Air Force Base, originally known as the Blytheville Army Field, which opened in 1942 as a training facility for World War II pilots, and at the height of the Cold War was converted to a Strategic Air Command alert mission. In December 2023, the U.S. Congress designated the center as a federal museum of the Cold War, along with the National World War I Museum and World War II Museum, one of just 14 other private museums to receive such a recognition. Envisioned as the future National Museum of the Cold War, the center's mission is to honor Cold War veterans, to educate and engage visitors in the complex history and global impact of the Cold War, and to deepen understanding of this important phase in American history through immersive experiences. The Blytheville Cold War Forum provides a nonpartisan public platform for the discussion of Cold War history, memory, and heritage. In particular, the forum seeks to foster informed debate over the public history of the Cold War, and these discussions, these sessions, all will inform the creation of the future museum. We also hope, with so many other museums and memorials on the Cold War in the making, to offer a platform for exchanging ideas, experiences, and best practices. We invite you to visit our website and take a look at some of the previous Blytheville Forum sessions. Today, we will discuss a new book that looks at the relationship between country music and the Cold War, something most people probably would not naturally think of in one sentence or even in one conversation. Joseph, can you see this? Joseph Thompson's Cold War Country, How Nashville Music Grew and the Pentagon Created the Sound of American Patriotism, traces the connections between popular music and the U.S. military during the Cold War, in particular, the country music industry's role in military recruitment since World War II, to show how the relationship between genre and militarism helped create the sonic and political color lines of the late 20th century. Joseph, we're delighted to have you join us today with a presentation on your book, and we're also very fortunate to have with us Professor David Suisman, Professor Gillian Hartley, and Orson Weems to engage Joseph in a conversation about the book's subject and arguments. Let me introduce them as I will give them the floor in our Zoom room here today. Dr. Joseph Thompson is assistant professor at Mississippi State University. His first book, Cold War Country, How Nashville's Music Grew and the Pentagon Created the Sound of American Patriotism, published last year by University of North Carolina Press, was named by Rolling Stone as one of the best books of 2024. That's quite a recognition. His other writings on race, music, and politics have appeared in academic journals like Southern Cultures, Modern American History, and American Quarterly, as well as several edited collections that he has to his credit. He has also contributed to popular outlets, including the Washington Post and Time, and has appeared as a featured guest on podcasts like NPR's On the Media and Lawfare's Chatter. Joseph is currently working on a new book project about country music, Civil War memory, and the lost cause. With that, David, we're just so delighted for you to join us here today. I'll turn the Zoom room over to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Christian. I appreciate you having me here, the invitation. It's nice to be virtually in Blytheville, Arkansas, just up the road from where I actually sit here in Starkville, Mississippi. And thanks to Jillian and Orson and David for joining me in this conversation today. So yeah, as Christian just said, I wrote this book, Cold War Country: How Nashville's Music Grew and the Pentagon Created the Sound of American Patriotism. When people hear that title, sometimes I think people just have a kind of gut reaction to it. Maybe Christian, maybe not you. You said that it was maybe kind of odd to put those together in a sentence, but I think some people do have a kind of general sense or some assumptions that they just kind of naturally understand the connection between country music and the military. And I think that that's reasonable because I always contend that no genre of popular music has a more recognizable link with the modern U.S. military than country music. And that's because there's a standard sort of narrative in place that says, in the late 1960s, as the counterculture protested the Vietnam War and as the civil rights movement notched these landmark victories, there was this white silent majority that clung to the allegedly all-American virtues of law and order and conservative social values, and that those people heard their feelings expressed in certain country songs like Merle Haggard's so-called backlash anthems, right? Okie from Muskogee and Fight Inside of Me. And ever since then, people have pointed to country music to kind of identify this certain strain of American patriotism, whether that's Merle Haggard or people like Lee Greenwood and his kind of Cold War nationalism heard in God Bless the USA, or Lee Greenwood's Desert Storm nationalism heard in God Bless the USA, or his 9/11 nationalism and God Bless the USA. He's really kind of milked that for all it's worth. And if you don't think of Lee Greenwood, maybe you think of, say, like Toby Keith, courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue, which he released in the wake of 9/11. So there's this kind of history for modern country music and connections to supporting the troops in times of war. But my book goes beyond these songs to explore a deeper history that's tied together support for U.S. militarization with country music. Country music's relationship to the military is more complex than just a handful of songs, and it didn't spring just fully formed from Merle Haggard and the silent majority. So my book traces how the Pentagon and the country music industry created an economic relationship that benefited the growth of the genre's commercial power, while also encouraging its white fan base to enlist in the Cold War military. Throughout the book, I refer to this reciprocal relationship as country music militarization. And that's just a kind of shorthand phrase that helps describe the economic, personal, and symbolic connections between the genre and the expansion of the defense state. Now, my book forwards three kind of main arguments to make this case. First, I argue that country music's entrepreneurs latched onto the expansion of the mid-century military as a way to help grow their businesses. Country music's business people booked artists on tours of military installations and on the front lines of the nation's wars. And when they did so, they could put country music in the eyes and ears of what were essentially captive audiences of young Americans. These business actors also joined with the Defense Department to create recruitment campaigns for radio and television that featured country music artists, another way to get country music in people's face. And this relationship gave the country industry arguably the most powerful promotional partner in the world to sell their products and a distribution network to expand their audiences around the globe, primarily through the Armed Forces Radio and Television Service, or the AFRTS, as well as the post-exchange or PX stores, those retail outlets that are located on our installations, the nation's installations around the world. And soldiers steadily increased the number of country music records they bought over the 1950s and 60s, and the European PXs eventually sold more country records than any other genre. Now, the second main argument is about how country music militarization helped white Southerners see the expansion of the military as part of their regional culture, rather than an intrusion of government power into their everyday lives. And I make this assertion by digging into the personal stories of service members who went on to country music fame. You can get overwhelmed in the archives by seeing how many country musicians were on this trajectory from being a service member to being a country star. Some of the big names that people might know are people like Faron Young, Johnny Cash, Tom T. Hall, Mel Tillis, George Strait. All of them used their time in the ranks to hone their craft as musicians and then launch themselves into stardom. So through these stories, I show how armed service really provided a springboard into professionalization for a lot of white country musicians. The third big argument shows that Music Row aligned with political conservatism because of the lucrative partnerships it had established with the Pentagon, and not because of some inherent ideology within its artists and fans. So as debates over the Vietnam War fractured the Cold War consensus, an unflinching commitment to the armed forces became a central tenet of a political outlook, and politicians who painted anyone who dared to question U.S. military policies as something less than patriotic. Now, what does that have to do with country music? Well, for a generation or more, Cold War defense policies assured a demand for more soldiers, and more soldiers meant steady pay, government benefits, and the creation of defense contractor jobs in the civilian sector to supply those troops. Those soldiers bought more country records and demanded that the AFRTS stations play them. And the Pentagon then used more country music in its recruitment and entertainment strategies. So just very simply put, the Cold War was very good for the country music business. And this is the relationship that I draw out over the course of the book, to show how this relationship made country music the sound of American patriotism. You'll excuse me just a second. So my story begins with a man who is really under-acknowledged but highly influential in the history of country music, a guy named Connie B. Gay. Connie Gay was this new dealer from North Carolina who moved to Washington, D.C. in the early 40s to work for the Farm Security Administration. In 1946, he began hosting the capital city's first country music show. And then he spent the rest of the 1940s building a country music media empire in the D.C. area that included a barn dance radio program that broadcast from Constitution Hall, live concerts aboard a yacht that sailed up and down the Potomac River called the Hillbilly Cruise, and daily radio shows. Now, Gay also recognized that he could promote his stations and the artists he managed if he tapped into the market of service members and their families. And he really made this concrete in 1951 when he booked Grandpa Jones on a tour of, if you don't know, Grandpa Jones, a longtime star of the Grand Ole Opry and later Hee Haw. In 1951, Gay booked him on a tour of bases in Japan and the front lines of the Korean War, where they reportedly played for 38,000 U.S. and UN troops. Gay capitalized on this success by booking more country artists in the U.S. military's global network of Cold War installations, including launching the career of country superstar Jimmy Dean. And as the Pentagon established the indefinite presence of U.S. soldiers in Europe, Asia, and the Caribbean, Connie Gay made sure that those troops heard the latest stars of country music live and in person during the 1950s. My book then shifts into the rise of country music recruitment, mainly through the story of a country singer named Faron Young and the growth of the music industry in Nashville in the mid-1950s. If you don't know, Faron Young would go on to be a country music Hall of Famer. But in the early 1950s, he was still a struggling singer from a dairy farm in Shreveport, Louisiana. He had started his musical career in 1951 on the Shreveport radio show, The Louisiana Hayride. He kind of had a sort of meteoric rise. By 1952, he had signed a recording contract with Capitol Records, and at the age of 20, he made his debut on the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. And then shortly after he played his first Opry gigs, he received his draft notice in November of '52. There's a quote that I always like to call attention to in here, where supposedly he went to the doctor to try to get out of military service, claiming that he had heart trouble, and the doctor said, "Yes, son, I can hear it breaking." But while he was still in basic training on Fort Jackson in South Carolina, he had a song called "Goin' Steady," which he had recorded before entering the service, and it broke onto the Billboard charts and shot up to #2. So his superior officers recognized Young as a potential resource for the promotion of military service, and they put him to use. In May 1953, they sent Faron Young to New York City to compete on the then new network television show Talent Patrol, which tried to boost Army recruitment and kind of general good feelings towards the military by showcasing the entertainment skills of servicemen. So this is like Star Search or American Idol, but all service members. Well, Young won the contest, and he spent the rest of his Army career entertaining current soldiers and recruiting others into the ranks. Now, following that success, the recruiting service began producing a new series of programs that combined country music star power and the recording business on Music Row. The radio and later television show Country Style USA led the way in these efforts and was recorded by Owen Bradley on Music Row. Now, if you're not familiar with country music history, Owen Bradley was one of the architects of the so-called Nashville sound, and he was the producer behind people like Loretta Lynn, Patsy Cline, some Johnny Cash, etc. If you were famous in the 1950s on Music Row, Owen Bradley had probably touched your record or your career at some point. Country Style USA presented 15 minutes of country music by some top names in the artists. People like Johnny Cash and Marty Robbins participated in this, alongside a message about the career opportunities available through the armed forces. And this was lucrative for people like Owen Bradley. The television version, which lasted from 1958 to 1960, cost the Army around $216,000, which would be about $2.5 million in today's money. Now, around the same time, the country music's business actors began consolidating their power and setting their sights on boosting the commercial prospects of Nashville and Music Row. In 1958, there was a group of promoters and songwriters and label executives who met up in Nashville to form something called the Country Music Association, or the CMA, which of course is still with us. And it functioned as a kind of chamber of commerce for country music. It promoted the economic growth of the genre, and also tried to kind of lift the reputation of the genre as something respectable for the white middle class. And the CMA's vision for the organization included growing country music's share of radio airplay and increasing the number of country records purchased by fans around the globe. In fact, they adopted the slogan "Best Liked Worldwide" when they launched this organization, and advertised it on the top of their newsletter. In fact, they have a sort of a symbol where it's a globe that is the bottom of a musical note and has the banner across it that says "Country Music Best Liked Worldwide." Now, this was certainly more aspirational than a reality when the CMA formed, but if global popularity is your goal, then what better way to grow that business during the 1960s than sustaining country music's link with the military? Now, the military also played an active role in policing the reputation and profitability of country music, primarily through the AFRTS. In 1965, Billboard magazine reported that the U.S. Armed Forces had begun a campaign in Europe to present country music as a, quote, integral part of the American cultural heritage and the American way of life. In fact, the military DJs received orders to stop referring to country music with the words hick, hillbilly, music from the sticks. So obviously some kind of disparagement going on about country music on military airwaves at one point. So instead, the military suggested referring to the genre as country, western, C&W, American folk music, or simply the music of America. They also increased the amount of country music on the air by 35% during the late 1960s. So with more country music on the air, service members began purchasing more country records, and the genre accounted for around 65% of the records sold in European PXs by the end of the 1960s. So in this sense, this patriotic branding effort that was essentially commanded by the Defense Department brought some real financial gains to Music Row at a clip of about $4 million a year, which multiplied for inflation would be around $40 million in today's money. There's even more evidence to suggest that there were individual musicians who profited from songs specifically about patriotism, if we kind of narrowly understand that as support for the troops and opposition to the peace movement. There's, Sergeant Barry Sadler's The Ballad of the Green Berets. There's Terry Nelson's Battle Hymn of Lieutenant Calley, Johnny Wright's Hello Vietnam, Dave Dudley's What We're Fighting For, Ernest Tubbs' If You Don't Love It, Leave It, and of course the previously mentioned Haggard backlash anthems, Okie from Muskogee and Fight Inside of Me. But I always like to call attention to the fact that country music could express more perspectives than this kind of simple wartime flag waving. Tom T. Hall, who wrote a song called Mama Bake a Pie, Daddy Kill a Chicken, and released it in 1971, I think is really kind of emblematic of a different way that country music could approach the war. Now, Tom T. Hall is one of the greatest songwriters in country music history and has written songs for all kinds of artists. In fact, he wrote Hello Vietnam for Johnny Wright and What We're Fighting For Dave Dudley. But this new song, Mama Bake a Pie, took a slightly different strategy when addressing the war. So in this song, Hall relays the story about a wheelchair-bound Vietnam veteran who's arriving home from the war. The song begins, people staring at me as they wheel me down the ramp toward my plane. The war is over for me. I've forgotten everything except the pain. And as this veteran comes into contact with more and more civilians, you learn about his condition by the answers that he gives to their questions, with lines like, "Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. It was worth it for the old red, white, and blue." And the chorus makes this simple request for his homecoming meal that you hear in the title. Mama bake a pie, daddy kill a chicken, your son is coming home 11:35 Wednesday night. Now, throughout the tune, you hear, the audiences hear only the voice of the soldier and his kind of projections about the reactions of his family and friends. His parents don't really know what to say. We learn that he's got this drunk uncle who makes a awkward suggestion about wooden legs, and we learned that his former girlfriend is uninterested in maintaining their relationship. So this young man depends on the self-medicating comfort of alcohol, which he keeps in a bottle under the blanket covering his legs. And with this first-person storytelling, Hall made people listen to the consequences of war. Consequences that included psychological isolation, chemical addiction, and the loss of physical intimacy. And I think it's important to call attention to the fact that country music can convey a story like that just as easily as Wavin' Old Glory down at the courthouse with Merle Haggard and the Okie from Muskogee. Now, country music militarization evolved after the end of Vietnam. At one time, Music Row could count on the military for its record sales and talent promotion. But the country industry had to reconfigure its ties to the military due to the changing demographics of who served in the ranks and the evolution of U.S. foreign policy. In 1973, President Nixon ended the draft and instituted an all-volunteer force. This personnel shift brought more minorities and more women into the military, particularly into the U.S. Army. African Americans, who were not the traditional target audience for the country music industry, more than doubled their numbers over the 1970s to make up 1/3 of the Army by 1980. And the Army and Air Force recruiting service actually instituted soul music recruitment campaigns in the 1970s to kind of prime the pump for this audience. And in fact, soul music took the top spot for the most popular genre of records sold in the PXs by 1985. But country music militarization has persisted, and it persisted in a new guise in the 1980s and 90s as these demographic and personnel evolutions were occurring. By the end of the book, I show how the country industry began using the armed forces less as a way to sell soldiers on country music and more to sell civilians on the idea of country music as the most patriotic genre. The Cold War politics of Ronald Reagan further blurred the line between patriotism and support for the military in the 1980s. And country performers, most famously Lee Greenwood and his song God Bless the USA, set up shop on that blurry line and helped turn country music into the sound of U.S. patriotism in the late days of the Cold War. By the time the Persian Gulf War rolled around, Greenwood's wartime opportunism exposed a transactional truth of country music militarization that I think continues into our current day. Whenever country music artists proclaim that they are proud to be an American, they show that that kind of spirit has always been good for Music Row's bottom line. With that, I'll stop and turn it over to David, and look forward to the conversation and questions.
Right on time. Thank you so much, Joseph, for this succinct overview. It's now my great pleasure to introduce real expert on the subject, one of the preeminent scholars on the subject, David Suisman, who is Associate Professor of History at the University of Delaware. He specializes in cultural history, war and society, history of music, sound studies, and the history of capitalism. Professor Suisman received his BA from Yale University and his PhD from Columbia, where his dissertation won the Bancroft Dissertation Prize. His latest book, Instrument of War, Music and the Making of American Soldiers, was published by the University of Chicago Press in November 2024. His first book, Selling Sounds, The Commercial Revolution of American Music, published by Harvard in 2009, was named one of Choice's outstanding academic titles for 2009 and received the Hagley Prize for Best Book in Business History and the DeSantis Book Prize of the Society of Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, as well as several other honors. He's also co-editor of Capitalism and the Census and Sound in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. With that, David, thank you for joining us, and the Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you, Joseph. I want to start by saying a few things about the book and then sort of turn this into a conversation. This may be evident to listeners and viewers from Joseph's remarks, but Cold War Country is a landmark book, and it is so for at least two reasons. First, it takes something that we know that is familiar to us, and that is that country music is powerfully patriotic. And it shows how this has a history. It sort of defamiliarizes what we think is automatic and shows that it has a history, which is to say, it isn't a function of something inherent in the music, but rather it's a function of a series of historical developments. So if many people today associate country music and country musicians with strong, outspoken support for the US military, as I think is quite common, this association doesn't come from traits in country music's DNA, but instead grew out of decisions and actions in particular times and places. Today, it is a commonplace to associate country music and ardent support for the armed forces, but Professor Thompson's book shows that this connection is a product of not of nature, but of history. So that's one thing. There does, but the second is not only does it does the intimate connection between country music and the military have a history, the book shows that it's a surprising history, and it's surprising because it brings together two entities which in the popular imagination, I think, seem quite distinct. And I think this is what Christian was alluding to in his introductory remarks at the outset. On the one hand, you have the military, and on the other hand, you have this commercial juggernaut that is the Nashville-based country music industry. Often people think about these in different categories, but the book shows how these two major institutions in American life have, in fact, been interconnected since the 1950s. In the popular imagination, the connection between the military and, let's say, the culture industry broadly, for most people, I think calls to mind, if you think about military and culture industry, most people, I think, calls to mind the USO in World War II, which famously staged hundreds of thousands of performances for American GIs, and then continued to provide live entertainment for soldiers in Korea and in the Vietnam War and beyond. But the story that Professor Thompson tells in this book concerns a different arm of the culture industry, which is to say Nashville's Music Row. And it shows how deeply the ascendance of country music in American popular culture and post-war American militarism were linked. Music Row reaped rewards from the publicity that the military could provide, from the promotion of country music on Armed Forces Radio, and from the huge sales potential of selling country music records to soldiers through the military PX stores. And then at the same time, in a complementary way, the military used country music to enhance recruitment, morale, and the military's popular reputation, finding in country music a language of masculine individualism that spoke with unusual potency to white middle class, working class Southerners. So when Dwight Eisenhower warned of the growing military industrial complex in 1961, I don't think he was thinking of the country music industry. But this book shows how culture and the culture industry were inseparable from the politics and heavy industrial sectors that Eisenhower did have in mind. Now, the chasm between the military and the country music industry was bridged in a lot of ways in the 1980s and 90s, especially with the war on terror. Joseph mentioned the popularity of songs like Lee Greenwood's "God Bless the USA," a monster hit of many moments. And this connection, I think, made the military and Nashville seem to many people like obvious or self-evident bedfellows. But the degree to which this connection had earlier been invisible, I think, bears emphasizing. And if I may, I'd like to offer one illustration of that invisibility, about how invisible country music in the military has been. Ken Burns' 18-hour, 10-part documentary series, The Vietnam War, purported to show the Vietnam War, quote unquote, from all sides. That series featured more than 120 songs in it, but to my count, only 2 were country music songs, and neither of those 2 was representative of the Nashville Music Row style country music that Professor Thompson's book shows was intimately interconnected with post-war militarism. One of the strengths of this book is Professor Thompson's skill at bringing together the work of three different kinds of actors. There were state and military officials who saw public-private partnership with the music industry as an opportunity to wield a uniquely American form of soft power. Second, there were influential leaders from the country music industry, especially Connie B, whom Professor Thompson spoke about. And then there were the musicians like Faron Young and the founding generation of Memphis rockabilly artists and Elvis Presley. Cold War country recognizes how all 3 of these groups contributed to, shaped, and benefited from the phenomenon that Professor Thompson calls country music militarization. Let me make one more quick point, and then I want to flip this over to some questions. And the point is that this book is really cultural history par excellence. And what I mean by that is that it is sometimes said that cultural history is valuable because it reflects the prevailing social, political, and economic relationships in a society. But the best cultural history does more than that, which this book does. The best cultural history demonstrates how culture is not just a reflection, but is in fact entwined with those social, political, and cultural relationships. Culture isn't just a metaphor, it's also a historical agent in its own right. So showing this is one of the book's signature achievements. I could go on about my appreciation for the book, but given its richness, I want to sort of highlight some of the generative questions that it raises. Um, and the first thing I want to ask about concerns that invisibility. The book offers abundant evidence that country music coursed through the US military in the 1950s and 60s. You can't read the book and not walk away with that. But given that, why has the prominence of country music in the military in this era, in the 50s and 60s and 70s even, remained essentially invisible? Now that you've written this book, it seems undeniable. But why has it taken until now for this to become visible, would you say?
Yeah, thank you, David. I mean, first of all, thank you for those kind words. It really means a lot coming from you, someone who I admire quite a bit and look up to their scholarship. And I love the fact that you brought up the Ken Burns statistic, which I read from in your book, Instrument of War, and absolutely, was kind of pumping my fist like, yes, you're right. Anyways, to your point, to your question, why has this remained invisible? I think it actually relates to Ken Burns in a way. When we think about music and the military, we often think, as you suggest, USO, which sort of calls back to a Bob Hope, Bing Crosby, World War II era situation, big bands, maybe Glenn Miller, this kind of thing, and that's what people think of when they think of music in the military from that era. Now jump forward to Vietnam, and there's a kind of baby boomer, I don't know if you want to call it nostalgia or a sort of mythology in a way about it being, as you call it in Instrument of War, a rock and roll war, right? So you think of the opening scenes of any kind of Vietnam documentary or fictional movie, and you're going to hear chopper blades and Creedence Clearwater. And that's sort of captured people's imaginations about what the military sounded like in these two very distinct eras, these kind of two different generations of service. And what I want to show is that while those are exemplary in their own ways, they're sort of exceptional because the kind of day-to-day grind of being in the military is not being in battle, right? It's about sort of working in a bureaucracy, and it's about people who have committed much of their life to that kind of labor, who may never carry a rifle in battle, who may be working a desk job and this kind of thing. And so then we look at the actual historical record of what music was selling to those people. And that's why I want to call attention to the fact that it was the European PXs that sold so many country records, right? I think that's reflective of the taste of those kind of career service people, or just maybe they weren't career service members, but people who were away from the front lines, who were working a job, and recognized that was indeed a form of labor, right? That working in the military is not all heroics and battlefield accomplishments, but is kind of the day-to-day driving a truck, right? Fixing the air conditioner in an office building. That too can be the military. And I think this is kind of, my book shows that maybe country music is more appropriate as a soundtrack of that kind of a service. This is not to say that people didn't love, Bing Crosby and Glenn Miller in the 40s and love Creedence Clearwater in Vietnam. I think your book and others has shown that indeed that was essential to the experience of many service members, particularly in Vietnam, this kind of rock and roll war, where they were using music as a kind of outlet for frustrations about that situation. But again, that's a very small number of people who ever saw combat like that in proportion to the rest of the military, right? And so then if we kind of zoom out of that and reconfigure what we think of when we think of military service, then we can start asking these questions about how other genres connect.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, that's great, and I think it really it speaks to something that's really important for historicizing the military in the Cold War, is that that argument troubles are that, thinking about music, the military as a monolith. And
Mm-hmm.
it really calls attention to the different kinds of people, different kinds of groups that exist within the military. And I think that's extremely valuable. Um,
Thank you.
I want
Oh, sorry. Can I add
Go
one
on.
more thing to that?
Yeah.
And this is about country music scholarship. Country music, just as a serious topic of historical inquiry, is really not that old. And a lot of the work has been done by scholars in who come from kind of literary studies, and look at sort of analyzing song lyrics, placing them in a historical context, but maybe not thinking about sort of political and institutional questions. And I was the beneficiary of being trained by historians who pushed me in that direction. So I'll say that I think that's the other reason for a sort of invisibility about this. It's just kind of the nature of country music histories up to this point, with a few exceptions. I mean, I could not have written this book without Diane Pecknold's book, The Selling Sound, which is just a marvel of country music scholarship. So yeah, but those are kind of exceptional. So much of it is sort of connected to journalism or literary studies.
Great. David, you
That's
want to
helpful.
go ahead? I want to bring in Orson and Jillian as well, but go ahead, David. Maybe one more question or so.
Maybe one more. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Thank you. Um, I have so many, but I'll ask one. Uh, the thing I was going to ask you to expand on comes from this argument that you make in the book that conservatism isn't part of the DNA of country music, that it's not inherently conservative. And I was wondering, given that argument, which you develop, if you could say something more about some of the country music artists who don't fall into that, whether it's left-wing country music artists or, dissident country music artists, and what was their relationship with that country music, that emergent country music conservatism?
Yeah, thank you. So the part of understanding that part of the argument is to say that it's not. Yes, you're right. I'm saying music is not inherently conservative, but I don't think it's inherently partisan one way or the other, right? And so when I talk about country music and its politics, I am talking about kind of the industry as a whole, and looking into the intentions of the business actors rather than individual artists. And I want to make that distinction. I mean, there's a spectrum of political opinions and ideologies within the kind of roster of country musicians in the mid to late 20th century. In terms of thinking about the sort of dissident, if not countercultural people that often come to mind, people will say, well, what about Johnny Cash, right? He was sympathetic to the peace movement and spoke out at different times against the war. What about Kristofferson, right? These people, and that is totally true. And on an individual level, they had those opinions, and this is one of the reasons I always throw in Tom T. Hall when I talk about this book, is because I think that is such a powerful song to show that kind of spectrum of opinion. Tom T. Hall has a great quote where he says, the job of a country songwriter is to reflect the stories of the people that need to be told, and their stories of people at peace marches and on military bases. And so he saw himself as sort of just as a storyteller who was representing all kinds of experiences that way. But the other thing I'll say is that, Chris Kristofferson, yes, an outspoken, advocate for peace, and admirably so, I think, was also a veteran himself, and came from a military family, and in fact got his kind of breakthrough in Nashville with a song called Vietnam Blues that is more violent than towards the peace movement than say, Fight Inside of Me or Okie from Muskogee. And now he came to regret that. but it just goes to show that even the people that we want to kind of hold up as the counterculture or sort of a road not taken for country music in terms of its politics also have their ties into that. It's also true of Johnny Cash, right? He was a participant in these recruitment campaigns, and he himself was a Air Force veteran too. So it's interesting. And one of the recruitment shows that I didn't talk about today is called Country Music Time. It aired from 1961 to 1986, and it was an Air Force show. And you look at the people who played that, and it's, Steve Earle, right, played on it. Lyle Lovett, people who you might think of as perhaps more progressive in terms of their politics. And it's not to say that they aren't. They're not being. I don't think they're being hypocritical or something like that. It's to show that it's inescapable for country musicians if they're going to make their way in the business. This was a stepping stone, and you participated in it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. And David, thank you for your incisive questions. Let's bring in somebody who's been on the inside of the music business, Orson Weems. He's the co-founder and executive director of the Music Education Initiative. Prior to heading this nonprofit, Orson worked as chief operating officer with the legendary music and entertainment icon Al Bell and his global music, entertainment, and artist development company, Al Bell Presents. Since 2006, Orson has been the president and majority shareholder of Land Improvement Company, a company founded in 1965 that specializes in construction management, civil construction, small building demolition, and industrial services for federal, state, and local projects. He's a graduate of the University of Arkansas, Fulbright College of Arts and Science with a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism. He was a Razorback offensive lineman and a 3-year letterman under the legendary coach Lou Holtz. We are very proud to call him a member of the National Advisory Board of the National Cold War Center. And Orson, just wanted to bring you into conversation, reactions to the presentation, and any questions for Joseph.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ostermann. It's a pleasure to be on here and to be with Dr. Thompson again. And I enjoyed his lecture over at Ole Miss, and to meet Dr. Suisman as well. I can tell you this, we need part 2 to this. This is incredible. And I have to agree that this is a landmark book, as Dr. Suisman said, and the things that were mentioned. I'm taking notes, so if you see me, I'm just writing notes because, again, the history and the culture of this is such an expansive amount of knowledge that we have taken for granted. We, meaning probably the majority of people that did not even recognize this title of the book and what it impacts and what it really means. And one of the things that I wanted to say is about this country music militarization is that I am so thankful that Dr. Thompson wrote this book, because for years, I would see and hear these songs that he's mentioned, a lot of this music. But what I also see that it has done is it opened up creativity, productivity, and a way for us to literally live our life the way our lifestyles are in the living that we deal with today. And one of the things I thought about was when Dr. Suisman said the different groups that were affected by not just the country music, but the different groups of the people that are in the military itself. And some of that, from our perspective, having grown up around some of the incredible soul and R&B music, as well as country music, I think of the likes of Ray Charles writing a country album that's gone. I think about Charlie Pride. I think about Edwin Starr with his song War. And then you think about iconic music, Marvin Gaye, what's going on? So we think about all of these things. So I wanted to ask Dr. Thompson, when you talk about this, even though it wasn't as popular with some of the groups, but we talk about the conservatism that led to patriotism. Tell me what your thoughts are on using some of the groups that felt marginalized by this push by the military, as with the big, gigantic budget to push country music like it did, especially in the start of the Cold War. And then as it changed over the decades, now we get into, as you said, soul music sells more at the PX in 1985 than country music.
Yeah, thank you, Orson. It's nice to see you again. That's a great question. That's one of the things that just in the service of, or in the interest of time, I couldn't explore in my comments. But the way that country music shaped the sort of racial climate of military service is a key part of my book, and it's interesting to see how country music becomes this sort of flashpoint of conflict between people in the service at different points, and often a point of conflict because of the sort of the racial connotations of country music. It's something I explored at different parts at different moments along the way throughout the sort of 50 years that I cover in Cold War country, and it's also interesting from a recruitment standpoint too, because and this is relevant to a lot of things that we're seeing in the headlines right now about who gets to serve and the personnel of who makes up our service. In the early 1960s, the Kennedy administration recognized that there was a lot of racial inequality in military service, and made an investigation into that. And what they found was that one of the problems was that their recruitment campaigns only featured white service members in it. Now, in this study, they didn't pinpoint country music as a particular problem, but as a historian, I'm able to make that claim because I can look at the historical record here at the archive and say, well, this is something that they missed, right? When they were looking at this and sort of trying to diagnose the problem. It's also interesting in terms of sort of just musicians in the military who were not afforded as many opportunities as the country musicians, and they were not able to sort of build on their reputation as a veteran in the same way that country musicians could. And that's a story that happens repeatedly in the book. It's interesting too that you have this connection to Al Bell, right? Because he makes a brief appearance in the book through a black country music singer from Mississippi named O.B. McClinton. And Al Bell signed O.B. To a subsidiary of Stax Records called Enterprise Records as a way to sort of push him as somebody who could maybe compete with Charley Pride. Charley Pride had just had a breakout album in the late 60s when O.B. McClinton was trying to make his way. And O.B. is one of those kind of case studies for the book to show that military service did not benefit a black country artist the way that it would a white country artist, right? Because he served in the Air Force. In fact, he discovered his real talent for singing country music while serving on Okinawa. Comes back to the United States, tries to launch his career, and it's a lot of sort of fits and starts and dead ends for him, unfortunately, because he's a really talented guy. But he would try to use his status as a veteran to sort of prove himself to country audiences, to say, hey, I'm like you, right? I'm a veteran and I hail from a small town in Mississippi. And it just wasn't enough to put him over with a lot of artists. So it's interesting to see how race factors into this all along the way.
Thank you. Finally, I know, Orson, you probably have additional questions, but I don't want to miss bringing in Jillian last but not least. Jillian Hartley is professor of history at Arkansas Northeastern College. Her research and training focuses on environmental history, cultural heritage, and commemoration, areas in which she has cultivated deep knowledge and experience. Of course, she shares the National Advisory Board of the National Cold War Center, so it's a real pleasure to welcome Jillian to this conversation with some thoughts and perhaps a final question for Joseph.
Thank you so much, Christian, and a big thanks to you, Joseph, and David as well. I have a question because you're looking at the Cold War. What I'm curious about is obviously you've done this extensive research to demonstrate how important it was for the American military to connect with a certain demographic. Do you know of any example on the Soviet side where perhaps maybe they were using music for recruitment efforts or something similar?
Yeah, thank you, Jillian. It's nice to see you again. That's a great question, and I'm afraid I really don't have a good answer to it. I know for a fact that there were people in West Germany who were broadcasting country music into East Germany as a kind of propaganda in a way, and the CMA was very proud of this. They brag about it in their newsletter. But in terms of the Soviets using any kind of music, I'm not aware of it. And that's one of my admitted shortcomings. You can't do it all in a book, and I wish that I could have figured that out or devoted more time to it. Unfortunately, I don't have those answers. There are instances. This isn't necessarily a Soviet use in the way that maybe you're thinking, but of course, there are the jazz tours that Penny von Eschen explored in her great book Satchmo Blows Up the World. That were U.S. kind of goodwill tours to sort of combat Soviet propaganda about the United States and its race relations. I do cover the State Department use of country music in the 1970s and some tours of the Soviet Union during that time, which, again, not getting at exactly what you're asking about, but there were people like Tennessee Ernie Ford went over to the Soviet Union and played shows, again, as a sort of goodwill statement. And it's interesting to see the Soviet reaction there. They really identified with his song 16 Tons, which what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt, right? They saw it as like a testament to capitalist exploitation, right? This guy was singing a song, that they could identify with, which is kind of a humorous thing. I don't think that's the intention of that song, and at least not in the same way that the Soviets were taking it. So that's as close as I get. But it's a great question. I've gotten it before. I should probably do some more follow-up research.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Jillian, do you have any more questions?
Well, just one last one. What's a future project that you have in mind, Joseph? Are you going to continue to pursue this route? And what's next for you?
Yeah, I'm currently doing some research on the lost cause in country music. I didn't think I would write another country music book. I have a lot of interest in a lot of other kinds of music and its connections to history. But this is something I started actually when I was a graduate student at the University of Mississippi. I got a master's there in Southern Studies, and my thesis there was about the lost cause and country music. And kind of folk music in general, and I think I'm working on that right now. I've got a chapter coming out later this year, I believe, in an edited collection called Confederates in the Record Cabinet about kind of 50s through the 70s in country music and its connections to Civil War memory. So it's another way of kind of finding these intersections of Southern culture / music and the military. And race. So that it's sort of exploring some of the same topics, but in a different way. And I appreciate David's comment about my, the way of doing doing cultural history in Cold War country is to show that is like a real a force of change, right? Rather than just a reflection of the past, but the culture actually pushed the direction of the country in a way. I'm trying to figure out how to do that with the lost cause. So I'm looking for from different ways of finding that, rather than just sort of analyzing lyrics and that kind of thing. So stay tuned. I'll be hopefully I'll be able to speak more about that in the near future.
Joseph, just one more final question. We have just about a minute or so left. I think it's always important for us historians, as we talk about our interpretations in books, to talk about our sources. Just talk for a moment. All of this didn't come to you, while listening to a bunch of records alone. Anyways, So just talk for a moment about the kinds of archives, the kinds of records you looked at, and then perhaps sort of as the final cherry on top of all of it, what was your favorite archival find?
Yeah.
Keep it succinct,
Yeah.
please.
No, that's a great one. So I tell people, there's kind of a common phrase that historians use about reading against the grain, and usually that means like taking a source and kind of reading between the lines for some kind of a deeper context or a deeper implications of a document. I like to think that I did something like that, except it was reading for topics at archives where that topic shouldn't exist in a way. So what that meant was spending a lot of time at the Country Music Hall of Fame archives in Nashville and reading for military, reading for letters from soldiers in fan magazines, reading for coverage of tours to military bases. So reading for the military in a music archive. And then it also meant going to the National Archives in College Park and spending a couple of summers there and reading for country music in military records. And once I started doing that, this world kind of opened, for me, and it was inescapable. It was kind of all over the place. Once you start seeing it in one place, all of a sudden it's everywhere. That was particularly true at the Country Music Hall of Fame, so I'm very grateful for access to those archives. And just one other way that this opened up to me was through O.B. McClinton, who I mentioned earlier. I was actually just going to write a one-off paper for the Pop Conference back in 2016 about O.B. McClinton. And I went down to Memphis and interviewed his sister, who's still with us, thankfully. And she gave me access to some family papers and some recordings of his. On one of those recordings was a snippet of him on one of those country music recruitment campaigns. And I was like, there's country music recruitment campaigns. And so I went back to the National Archives and started searching. And, I found O.B. McClinton in the National Archives, having just talked to his sister in Memphis. So it was about making those kinds of connections in unexpected places.
Wonderful. What a fascinating topic and a wonderful discussion this afternoon. I'm so thankful to you, Joseph, to David, Orson, Jillian. Really stimulating conversation that I think certainly has me thinking about how some of this will be part of the future exhibition at the National Cold War Center. With that, thanks to all of you, and we're adjourned.